of the main things that Ninjago is known for is the fight scenes. There are some fantastic fights that we have gotten to see over the course of the years, and they are some of the most known and some of the most talked about aspects of the show itself. And there are so many different fight scenes that are absolutely fantastic. There are always going to be a fight scene that is someone's favourite, and a lot of the more flashy looking fight scenes are definitely up there for most people, me included. However, there is one type of fight that we get to see sometimes in Ninjago, but not as often, that I think is better than the big flashy fight scenes. And that for me, without a doubt, is when we get those very specific scenes where it's one or two characters fighting against each other and it's a very emotionally driven fight. There is a certain level of intimacy to the fight and there is never usually a lot of words spoken, but for the most part, it really does show off where the characters are standing at that moment in time. And I have to say, I love those fights. I think they are most definitely some of the best ones we've gotten, and I want to talk about a couple of them in particular before I get to the fight scene that is in Ninjago that is debatably the best fight scene that we have ever gotten. And it's because they have got those emotional aspects, but it has one thing that separates it from every other fight scene we've ever had in Ninjago. Now, you can of course argue that every single fight scene has got an element of emotional intimacy when it comes to it, but for a lot of the fights, it doesn't seem to be that is at the forefront. Take any fight with, say, Lloyd and the Overlord. There is an emotional weight to each of the fights, but when it comes down to it, it's mainly just the big flashy fight scene. I mean, every single Overlord versus Lloyd fight has ended up in a handful of dragons being used, and I think that is absolutely fantastic. But when I think of a more intimacy, more emotional weight when it comes to the fight scenes, the first one I honestly think of is Lloyd versus Harumi in season 12. Of course, whether or not this is Harumi is a whole nother thing. I am somewhat on the tinfoil hat theory that this is actually Harumi and she's just simply in Prime Empire. But the thing is that regardless of that fact, whether it's real Harumi or not, there is a lot of weight to this scene, and it definitely makes it one of the most memorable things of Prime Empire. Harumi, or fake Harumi, is using the information that she has about Lloyd to her advantage to be able to get an edge on the fight that they are having. She is really trying her best to be able to win the fight by getting into Lloyd's head, and to an extent, it is working, and you can tell in the way that they are fighting against each other. If you pay attention to how they are actually using the swords against each other, it says a lot about how they are actually fighting. Harumi, or again fake Harumi, is using very quick, very jab-like attacks. Attacks that are going to hurt, are going to sting, but they don't exactly do much in the way of damage to Lloyd. It's mainly just the point of it, the sharpness, and the very quick succession of them is what makes them very effective. The benefit to this is that we can quite literally see how much damage it is doing to the other person. So Harumi's attacks are definitively not doing too much damage. It's just the fact that she does a lot of them. But you go over to Lloyd, for example, he's just trying his best to avoid each and every attack. He doesn't want to fight Harumi in this instance because he doesn't actually know whether or not it's a real Harumi or not. And every single instance where he was basically forced to strike Harumi because it was either that or she would strike him, you could tell that they are very loaded hits, very hard hits in moments, and you can see that they do a lot of damage. So instead of doing a lot of smaller attacks, they are single big attacks. It's almost like he's trying to attack it in a way of trying to make a stop. And it very much, like I said, reflects the emotional state of the two in the moment. Harumi is just trying her best against Lloyd's head, and it's just doing these very rat-stratty, very manipulative kind of attacks. Whereas Lloyd's are very emotionally hitting attacks. The sadness or the anger towards Harumi is causing him to be almost more aggressive in reaction. And that's a very recurring theme in these more emotionally speaking fights. Every single ninja, when they're evolved, their attacks are much more passionate, and you can see in the way that they do them. It's a prime example of the intimacy and the emotional weight of these fight scenes, because, like I said, in the end, they officially don't even beat each other to an extent because they both die at the exact same time. They both cease to be in the exact same moment. There's not a winner in this fight. They both lost. And you can kind of tell by the fact that there is no other words spoken. Lloyd knew he was defeated in that moment, he just doesn't say another word because he simply didn't need to. It's honestly one of my favourite fights in all of Ninjago, especially the 11-minute era, and for that reason, it's a perfect example on why the emotional weight to a fight scene can really have a memorable effect. I love that fight scene, purely just for the dialogue, especially the moment where Lloyd realized that she wasn't actually Harumi. He asks a question that only Harumi would be able to answer, and she gets it wrong, and he, in reaction, does begin to attack her, but there's still the very heavy-weighted attacks because he's still in that very emotional beat. It's perfect. It's such a good fight, and honestly, a perfect example. Another fight scene that really shows off the intimate aspect and the emotional weight to a scene has to be Kai versus Crux. In Season 7, Kai is in a very emotionally diverse position. Of course, he's initially very mad at the Time Twins because of their involvement with his parents, and then he's mad at his parents because he thought they were traitors. But again, he is still angry towards the Time Twins, but then for a different reason. Honestly, Kai's emotional state in Season 7 is kind of underrated in a lot of different ways. It's really interesting to see, and I really did enjoy the aspects, and it has its culmination in the fight against Crux. Kaiyo is typically a very skilled fighter, especially with the sword. In this scene is at a very major disadvantage. He is not fighting correctly because of the emotional weight of the situation. He believes that Wu was lying to him, his parents were traitors, and Crux and the Chronics were actually right in the moment. He thought that the villain that was in front of him was actually someone who had a point. It was really interesting to see, and again, you can see it in the fight between the two of them. When it is just the two, Crux is not really trying to attack Kai, if you notice. He's mainly defending himself and mainly just making Kai trip over his own feet while he is able to get into his head. Crux is a genius in this fight because he is using Kai's emotional instability against him. And then when you get to Kai, you notice that his attacks are so distinctly different from how we usually see him. Kai is just rushing in sword up. That is not typically how Kai fights, even in the earlier era. You could see that in a lot of instances, Kai always kept his sword quite close to his chest, especially in the earlier seasons. However, in this instance, you actually see that he's just holding his sword out. He's leaving himself open to attack. And you can see that's the case because Crux is constantly making him trip over his own feet. It really did speak a lot to the mental state of Kai, because you realize that it is so distinctly different, and it didn't even end there, because when Kai has the help of Nia and also Acronix is in the fight, it never actually ends, because when Kai actually uses his elemental power, he again uses it in a way that we never actually saw before. Typically speaking, when it comes to Kai's elemental power, he just really fires it off. He just fires it at the opponent. He never really has anything in the way of close hand to hand. But in the fight specifically against Crux, you will note that actually Kai tries to use his fire to have a much harder punch. That is again very much out of character when it comes to Kai. In every other situation, Kai will always resort to some sort of ranged attack. This is, as far as I'm aware, the only instance we ever actually saw Kai use the power of fire in such an intimate context. And again, it really does hold a weight when it comes to the topic we're talking about. It just goes to show that these very emotional scenes with a lot of dialogue between the two of them really does have an emotional effect. And there are so many other fights that do have examples of this. These are just two of the ones that are personal favorites to me. But in my opinion, they don't even hold a candle to the one I want to talk about finally, because it covers every single aspect we've just talked about to a whole new level. In my opinion, one of the best fights we have got in Ninjago, especially under the topic of these more intimate one-on-one fights, has to be from Season 8. It is, without a doubt, Zane versus Mr. E. Now, there are plenty of other fights that also fall under this category, but in my opinion, Zane vs Mr. E is an aspect to the fight that has so much more of a weight to me and really does go to show that these fights in Ninjago really do have something special about them. And that is the fact that there is basically no dialogue between the two while still keeping the same amount of emotional weight. Go from the scene from the very beginning to the very end, of course, it is with the revelation that Mr. E is in fact a robot, and Zane is very desperate to know who the Quiet One actually is, and that is the main crux of the argument. Zane is the only one who speaks in the scene, and he only ever asks one question: are you the Quiet One? That entire line, that entire question is the only thing that is spoke between the two of them, yet there is still so much weight to that one line in of itself, and the weight is then also shown just through the fight scene alone. Again, at the very beginning of the fight, Zane asks, "Are you the Quiet One?" And all Mystery does is crack his neck, and Zane, in one of the most aggressive tones that we've ever seen for the character, and I think ever for that matter, repeats the question, Are you the quiet one? And it is the beginning of knowing that this scene is truly something else. Zane asks, like I said, in one of the most aggressive tones we've ever heard the character actually speak in. It is something that we do not have for the character of Zane, yet it's there. I recommend you go back and just listen to how he asks the question. It is beyond aggressive, and honestly, I love it. Zane's next action in that moment only continues to amplify it because he immediately pulls his weapon and he fires the bow at Mr. E's head. Again, unusually aggressive for the standards of Zane, but again really goes to show the state that Zane is in that moment. If Mr. E didn't deflect the arrows like he did, they would have gone straight through his head, and I have no doubt that that would have been the case, and that is what Zane initially intended. But it's only then when Mr. E gets close enough and throws him towards the cliff and Zane loses the bow. It makes things more intimate because they now officially have to be close to each other. And again, the cliff is also a very important aspect here, but I will go into that part later. Zane and Mr. E at this point get into hand-to-hand combat, and much similar to the reveal that your parents may be traitors, or the reveal that the person who you love by all accounts is not actually the real person, Mr. E is hitting Zane exactly where he needs to hit Zane. And you can see in his facial expressions, Zane, while still very angry, is starting to actually panic, because every single blow that Mr. E is putting towards him is actually very successful in a very interesting way. Each and every single one of them hurt Zane, like he knew exactly where to punch. The very physical form of what exactly goes on with the emotional dialogue. The shot then actually zooms out and does this pan over of the fight between the two of them, and it really does show that even though it's a very weighted, very emotional fight, it's still actually a very small fight. It's not the Overlord and Lloyd going at each other with dragons, or it's not the city being flooded by Wojira. It is just two ninjroids fighting against each other in the middle of the desert, and on its own it doesn't really look significant when you look at it from that perspective. But then when you go right back into the shot, where that emotional weight really does come straight back. Honestly, it was a genius way of showing that in the grand scheme of things, the fight wasn't really consequential in a lot of different ways. But in reality, it was to Zane. But this is where we get to, without a doubt, the most important part of the fight to me, because it explains the cliff and it explains Zane's mental strength when it comes to this moment. Because after their initial hand-to-hand combat, Mr. E pushes Zane back, and Zane actually starts to pop out of place. You can actually see a part on his torso actually pop out, and that was really interesting. Zane gets back up and puts himself back together, and he does something with his elemental power that we've actually never seen Zane do. Very similar vein to Kai, but honestly more important than Kai's in my opinion, Zane actually goes to use his elemental power, and for the only time, Zane is punching Mr. E with his elemental power. Of course, it was really unusual for Kai, because typically speaking, he doesn't do that, but in this case, Zane did it. Someone who only ever really uses their power for defensive means. He never really uses it in this aggressive of a tone, yet he still did, punching Mr. E, asking who is actually in charge. And this is where I honestly think you could really see how much weight and how aggressive and angry Zane truly was in that moment. This is really aggressive for Zane's standards, and really does show how much this actually means to him. And again, with the aspect of the cliff, the whole point of this cliff is that you can actually see what the two are trying to do in this moment. Mr. E is trying to send Zane off of the cliff. He is trying to defeat Zane by pushing him off of the cliff and damaging him too much. Whereas Zane, like I said, where he did the ice punches, could have very easily have just pushed Mr. E off of the cliff and won the fight. However, he purposely pushes him the other way because he wants the answers that he is looking for. Zane could have won the fight with Mr. E, but chose not to because he just simply wanted to know who the Quiet One was, and his aggression towards it completely shrouded the ability to win the fight. And it is no better explained than the fact that when Zane does it and pushes Mr. E away, Zane is sat there waiting for an answer, he's not getting it, and Mr. E is actually breaking out. And Zane lets out this aggressive anger sigh that we never again see for someone like Zane. He is so beyond aggressive at this point, and really does show how much weight is actually in the fight itself. And then we get to the final moments of the fight. Mr. E is broken out, refuses to answer the question, and again resorts to the hits and the kicks that would surely damage Zane, and he officially damaged Zane too far, and Zane is realizing at this point that he is defeated, and he actually says that you don't need to do this. For a moment the anger subsides because he realizes he's in the face of danger, and he realizes that he's going to be defeated. But Mr. E doesn't care, pushes him off the cliff and damages him beyond repair. He is at the bottom of the cliff, and Zane shuts down because he has officially taken too much damage. And even in his last moments, he still asks who he is. Honestly, the emotional aspect of this fight is so unheard of, and honestly, I can't believe they accomplished this with so little dialogue. And of course, it goes without saying that ending off with the theme that they used for Zane's death in Rebooted definitely did add to the weight, because I think I speak for most Ninjago fans when I say that that scene scarred most of us because of the loss of Zane. So again, ending off with that scene, I think is also them acknowledging that this is a very emotional scene and has every single emotional beat that is in every other emotional fight, but really heightened to the extreme with the added boost of there not even being many words between them. But this is, in my opinion, Ninjago's best fight scene for a very, very good reason. I don't think there has ever been a Ninjago fight that has had this much emotional weight with this little for us to actually innately just pick up on. It's really in the details that really shows the weight of this fight. And like I said, this is a very different version of Zane. This is Zane pushed to his limits. This is Zane who really didn't have anything else in his mind other than I needed my answers. It was very interesting to see it for usually the one who's very logical, very passive, and honestly just very kind-hearted. Like I said, go back and listen to Zane in this scene. The weight and the aggression in his words was truly something else, and it needs its praises for that reason. But of course, does it beat the very big and flashy fights that we see in Ninjago? Does it beat, say, Lloyd vs. Garmadon even later on in the season, or the Season 9 fight, or Cole vs. Vangelis? There are so many different fights that you could compare it to, but when you think of the emotional intimacy of Ninjago fights, I truly think this is one of the best ones. And again, like I said, of course, Lloyd vs. Garmadon in Season 8 is something else as well. But I do feel like that fight is really good because of the dialogue between the two of them, whereas with this one, I just feel like the lack of dialogue really did give it that extra push, and I feel like it needs that praise for its reason. Also, I know that me saying all this isn't a hot take, but I just really wanted to explain why I love this fight so much. And honestly, above all else, this has just given me a new appreciation for this fight scene, along with the other two, because looking at the small details like this really did go to show that these fights do have something truly special about them. I love them so much, and I would love to know if you guys like them as much as I do. And also, just in general, what are your favorite Ninjago fight scenes? Do you think there are ones that are better than this and fulfill the criteria that I set more than this fight itself? I would love to know. And also, do you want me to look at more Ninjago fight scenes in this vein? Do you want me to look at the big and flashy fights and analyze them in the same vein? I would love to know what you guys think when it comes to this topic, because like I said, Ninjago fights are some of the best parts of the show, and I would love to know if you guys would like to talk about these more. But that is about it for today, you guys, and thank you very much for watching, and take care. Okay,